Keep him stable! Ropes are secure! Lower away! Hurry, get him inside! Don't lose him!
Chest seal's failing. He's got a tension pneumo building tied. I need a 14 gauge and the largest bore needle in this building. Right now.
Code blue incoming! Move the cart!
I'm on it! Clear the way!
Get the crash cart here now.
He's coding! Move, move, move!
Commander Vale.
A war-zone trauma surgeon who saved more soldiers than she can count now hides behind the name. Dr. Vale. At a two-room clinic on the Maine coast, mopping floors between patients so nobody asks about the years she can't talk about.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the clinic.
The clinic's arrogant director likes to remind her, in front of the whole staff, that she is nothing, a burnout nobody who got lucky with a medical degree. He has no idea that the woman he humiliates every morning once kept a Navy SEAL platoon alive in a valley with no evacuation, no blood bank, and no time. Tonight, a storm is rolling in off the Atlantic, and so is a helicopter carrying a wounded officer who has spent 12 years looking for her. He is about to walk back into her life bleeding out on a stretcher, and the man who has spent 6 months tormenting her is about to learn exactly who he picked a fight with. If this story pulls you in already, do me a favor. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Dr. Vale's story travels before sunrise. And if you believe the quiet ones are usually the most dangerous people in the room, hit subscribe before the storm hits, because you are not ready for what happens in Chapter 3. Dr. Elena Vale had learned, over 11 months at Cutter's Cove Family Clinic, that the safest place to hide a war was inside a boring routine. She restocked gauze at 7 a.m. She logged vitals at 7:15. She let Dr. Marcus Wade call her the new girl, even though she was 38 years old and had once been addressed as Commander by men who did not use that word loosely. The clinic sat at the edge of a fishing town so small it did not appear on some maps, tucked between a boarded-up cannery and a stretch of pine trees that smelled like the only 2 winters she had ever loved. She had picked this place on purpose.
Good morning, everyone.
She had circled it on a map in a VA parking lot in Norfolk 2 years ago, closed her eyes, and told herself that if she was going to disappear, she would disappear somewhere the ocean could not find her twice. Cutter's Cove barely had cell service. It barely had a working X-ray machine. It was, in other words, perfect. Nobody here had ever heard of a hospital ship called the Comfort, or a forward surgical team that worked out of a shipping container for 4 months without losing a single patient who reached them alive. Nobody here needed to know that this quiet woman with tired eyes had once made decisions that generals studied afterward. Marcus Wade ran the clinic the way he ran his own reputation, loudly, and with far less substance than the volume suggested. He was 51, thick through the shoulders from a gym habit he mentioned constantly, and fond of a framed certificate on his office wall from a tactical medicine weekend course he liked to describe as though it were Army Ranger school. He had inherited the clinic from his father and treated the staff the way he imagined a battlefield commander might, without ever having stood anywhere more dangerous than a hunting cabin. He called the morning huddle to order by rapping his knuckles on the reception counter, and every nurse in the building straightened automatically, the way people do around someone whose temper they have learned to predict. "Vale," he said, not looking up from his clipboard. "You're on wound care and inventory again. Try not to slow us down." He said it every morning. Every morning, Elena said nothing, because 11 months ago she had made a rule for herself: no attention, no history, no reason for anyone to look twice. She filed his cruelty the way she filed everything else now, quietly, without expression, in a drawer she did not open. The only person at Cutter's Cove who ever looked twice was Nurse Callie Reyes, 26 years old, sharp-eyed, and still new enough to the job to be angry about things the older staff had gone numb to. Callie had grown up in this town, knew every family that walked through the door, and had a habit of hovering near Elena during the worst of Wade's outbursts, as if standing close enough might absorb some of it. He's going to run you off like he ran off the last two, Callie murmured one morning, handing Elena a stack of charts. Nobody stays here more than a year. Elena only nodded, because the truth, that she had nowhere else she wanted to go, and nothing left in her old life worth returning to, was not something she could explain to a 26-year-old who still believed doctors like Wade were the scariest thing a person could survive. Elena had survived worse than scary. She had survived quiet things that never made it into any after-action report. What none of them knew, not Wade, not Callie, not the mail carrier who waved at her every morning without knowing her real rank, was that Elena Vale had once held the title of commander in the United States Navy, a trauma surgeon attached to a special operations surgical team that deployed everywhere the regular hospitals could not reach. She had operated in the backs of moving vehicles. She had kept a 19-year-old corpseman breathing for 6 hours with nothing but her hands and her voice, talking him through his own panic while shrapnel worked its way toward his heart. She had a Bronze Star folded in a shoebox in a closet she had not opened since she moved to Maine, because looking at it reminded her of the mission that ended her career, the one where half her team did not come home, and she had come home changed, in ways doctors called moral injury, and she called simply unforgivable. She had traded her uniform for a name nobody would recognize and a job nobody would respect, because the version of herself that people respected had cost her too much. The morning the call came in, none of that mattered yet. It was an ordinary Tuesday, a sprained ankle, a child with an ear infection, an elderly fisherman who needed his blood pressure checked. Elena moved through the small rooms the way she had moved through combat triage, efficient, unremarkable, invisible. She had almost convinced herself that invisibility was a kind of peace. She had almost convinced herself that the war was over, that the woman who used to make split-second decisions about who lived and who did not had been retired successfully, buried under enough routine to stay buried for good. She did not yet know that a storm system was building 300 miles off the coast, or that somewhere over the Atlantic a Navy helicopter had already changed its flight plan, or that the name on the incoming manifest, Reyes, was about to mean something entirely different than the nurse standing beside her. If you've ever watched someone hide their whole worth behind a job that doesn't deserve them, you already know Elena's pain. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight, because this story is about to travel a lot farther than Cutter's Cove. And if you want to see the moment Marcus Wade finds out exactly who he's been humiliating, subscribe now, because Chapter 2 is where the ocean brings her past back to shore. The radio at the front desk crackled to life at 4:52 in the afternoon, cutting through the low hum of a clinic that had never once, in Elena's 11 months there, received a trauma call over the emergency channel. Cutter's Cove, this is Coast Guard Rescue 62. We have a Navy helicopter making an emergency diversion to your coordinates. Single patient, penetrating chest trauma, ETA 11 minutes, requesting trauma-capable facility, how copy? Callie's hand froze over the intake log. Wade, who had been halfway through a lecture about billing codes, straightened like a man smelling opportunity. We are not a trauma center, he said to no one, already reaching for his white coat as if the coat itself conferred the skill he did not have. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a cold clarity she recognized instantly and hated recognizing, because it belonged to a version of herself she had buried on purpose. 11 minutes. A gunshot or blast wound, penetrating chest trauma, Navy asset this far off a shipping lane, that combination did not happen by accident. Something had gone wrong on a training exercise, or something worse. She caught herself counting supplies before her mind had finished processing the danger, the way her hands had always moved faster than her fear. Wade barked orders that sounded almost correct and were, in every meaningful way, wrong. Get the ONIG out, prep the exam room, somebody call the county hospital and tell them we're sending a patient their way in an hour. An hour. Elena did the arithmetic Wade could not, a penetrating chest wound, 40 extra minutes of transport time to the county hospital, a storm closing the roads faster than anyone in this room understood. That math ended in a body bag, and she had spent a decade of her life refusing to let that math win. He won't survive the transfer, she said quiet, the words out before her rule against attention could stop them. Wade turned on her with the particular fury of a man who has just bade corrected by someone he has spent months insulting. This isn't your call, Vale. Go restock the supply closet. Callie's eyes went wide, darting between them, and for the first time in 11 months, Elena did not look away first. The helicopter set down in the gravel lot behind the clinic 9 minutes later, rotor wash flattening the beach grass, rain coming sideways off the water in sheets. 2 crewmen wheeled the stretcher through the back doors, soaked through, shouting vitals that Wade wrote down slower than the numbers were changing. The patient on the stretcher was a man in his early 40s, dog tags tangled at his throat, a combat tourniquet cinched high on one leg and a chest seal already failing at the edges, blood bubbling with each labored breath. Elena's eyes did the same 3 things they used to do in a shipping container off the coast of a country she was not allowed to name: the angle of the wound, the color creeping into his lips, the rhythm of a chest that was filling with something it should not hold. She knew this pattern. She had treated this exact pattern more times than she could count, and every one of those times, speed had been the only medicine that mattered. Then the man's eyes opened, and found hers, and something in Elena's chest did not shift so much as shatter. She had spent 12 years making sure she never had to see this face again, not because she did not want to, but because the last time she saw it, she had told him a lie so that he would let her go save someone else, and she had never forgiven herself for the years of silence that followed. Jake Reyes, lieutenant commander now, judging by the collar device pinned crooked to his flight suit, looked at her through blood loss and shock and said the only 2 words that mattered. Commander Vale. Not doctor. Not Elena. Commander. The name she had buried in a shoebox with a medal she never looked at, spoken out loud in a room full of people who had no idea what it meant. Wade, still fumbling with a chest tube kit he had clearly never used outside a training video, snapped at her again. I said get back, Vale, you're not. He never finished the sentence, because Elena had already moved, hands steady in a way that 11 months of restocking gauze had never managed to erase, and the entire clinic was about to learn, in the next 4 minutes, exactly who had been mopping their floors. Tell me you didn't feel your chest tighten the second he said her real name. Comment your city or country right now, because I promise you this story only gets heavier from here. And if you believe some people are only quiet because the world never gave them a reason to be loud, subscribe before Chapter 3, because that is where Marcus Wade finally finds out what rank he's been yelling at. Elena's hands moved before her mind finished the sentence it was building, the old rhythm returning the way a language returns to someone who swore they had forgotten it. Chest seals failing, he's got a tension pneumo building, I need a 14 gauge and the largest bore needle in this building right now, she said, and her voice had changed, not louder, but lower, flatter, carrying the specific weight of someone who has said sentences like this while people were dying and needed to believe her anyway. Callie moved before Wade could object, sliding a tray toward Elena with hands that shook only slightly. Wade opened his mouth to reassert control and then closed it, because something about the way Elena had positioned herself, feet planted, spine straight, made him take an involuntary step back, the way a much smaller animal sometimes steps back from a much larger one without knowing exactly why. Elena found the space between Jake's second and third rib with 2 fingers, the decompression needle in her other hand, and did not hesitate the way a person who had only read about this procedure would hesitate. There was a hiss of trapped air escaping, and Jake's chest, which had been rising in shallow, useless movements, took one deep, real breath. That's not clinic protocol, Wade said too late, his voice thinner than it had been 30 seconds ago. You can't just, who told you that you could? Elena did not look at him. She was watching Jake's oxygen saturation number climb on the pulse oximeter, watching the gray leave his lips, cataloging every vital sign the way she had once cataloged them in places with far worse lighting and far less time. Get me the suture kit and 2 units of Oneg, she said to Callie, who was already moving, already understanding something Wade had not yet caught up to, that whoever this woman really was, she was the only person in the building who knew what she was doing. Wade tried once more, physically stepping between Elena and the gurney, chest puffed out with the particular desperation of a man watching his authority evaporate in real time. I am the physician of record in this clinic, and I am telling you to step back." Elena finally looked at him, and the look was not anger. It was something worse for a man like Wade. It was pity. "You've never opened a chest that wasn't in a training manual," Elena said, quiet enough that only he and Callie could hear it. "And this man is going to die in the next 90 seconds if you don't move." She did not wait for permission. She had spent a decade learning that permission was a luxury combat medicine did not always allow, and some rules mattered more than the ones written on a clinic org chart. Jake's blood pressure was dropping again, faster now, and Elena's mind ran the calculation she had run 100 times before in worse rooms. Internal bleeding, probably the subclavian, no time to wait for an ambulance, no time to wait for anyone's permission slip. "I need him on the exam table, now, and I need everyone who isn't holding a suture or a light to get out of my way." Her voice cracked through the room like something that had command behind it, and for the first time in 11 months, every nurse in that clinic moved on Elena's word instead of Wade's. What happened in the next 6 minutes would be described later, by 3 different nurses, in 3 slightly different ways, but every version agreed on the same core fact. Dr. Elena Vale opened Jake Reyes's chest on a folding exam table in a 2-room clinic with instruments meant for stitching fishing hook wounds, found the bleeder before he lost enough blood to stop matching, and closed it with a steadiness that made Callie cry quietly into her own shoulder while she held the retractor. Wade stood in the doorway the entire time, no longer shouting, no longer certain of anything, watching a woman he had called the new girl. For 11 months perform a procedure he would not have survived attempting. When Jake's blood pressure stabilized and his color returned and the immediate danger passed, the room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent after death has been in the building and decided, this time, to leave. If you've ever watched a bully go quiet the second the truth walked in, comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far across the world this moment travels tonight. And if you think a title on a wall means nothing next to what a person can actually do under pressure, hit subscribe before Chapter 4, because Marcus Wade is about to make one more mistake, and it is going to cost him everything. Jake was stable but not safe, moved into the clinic's single recovery room while the storm outside made the county hospital's roads impassable for at least another 6 hours, which meant Elena would be the only surgeon he had until morning. She sat beside his bed at 2 a.m. monitoring his vitals manually because the clinic's monitor kept losing signal in the storm, and it was in that quiet, exhausted hour that the 12 years between them finally caught up to both of them at once. "You told me you were being reassigned stateside," Jake said, his voice raw from the breathing tube that had come out an hour earlier. "I looked for you for 2 years, Elena. I had people looking. You just disappeared." Elena kept her eyes on the monitor, because looking at him made the old grief rise up faster than she could manage it. "I lied to you," she said simply. "Because if you had known where I was really going, you would have followed me into a mission that was never going to bring both of us home, and I could not carry that. I had already lost enough people that year. I was not going to lose you too." The mission she meant was the one that ended her career, the one whose details lived in a file marked classified that even now she was not permitted to discuss, but the shape of it she could give him: a valley, a compound, 4 hours without air support, and a decision that fell to her because the ranking officer on the ground had been the first one hit. She had made triage calls that day that any ethics board would call correct and that had haunted her every single night since, because correct and survivable are not always the same thing for the person making the call. Jake reached for her hand, slower than a man in full health would have, and she let him take it, because 12 years of pretending she did not want to had exhausted something in her that pride used to guard. "I read the after-action summary," he said quietly. "The parts that weren't redacted. You kept 9 men alive that day, Elena. 9. And you've spent 12 years acting like you failed." Down the hall, Marcus Wade was making the second mistake of his night, this one considerably more foolish than the first. Having spent the last several hours quietly Googling terms he had heard Elena use: subclavian bleed, tension pneumothorax, forward surgical team, Wade had arrived, alone in his office at 3 in the morning, at a version of the truth that terrified him for entirely selfish reasons. If word got out that a Navy trauma commander had performed a life-saving thoracotomy in his clinic because he had been too incompetent and too proud to let her near the patient sooner, his license, his father's clinic, and his reputation in this small town would not survive the story. So Wade did what small, frightened men do when they sense the ground shifting under them. He decided to get ahead of it by making himself the hero of a story that was never his. He drafted an incident report, in his own handwriting, describing how he had directed the emergency thoracic intervention and Nurse Vale had assisted, and he planned to have it typed and filed before the Coast Guard's official inquiry arrived at dawn. Callie found the draft on his desk at 5 a.m. while looking for a chart, and it was Callie, 26 years old, angry in the specific way young people get angry when they finally understand exactly how long an injustice has been running, who carried it straight to Elena's recovery room without knocking. "He's rewriting what you did," Callie said, hands shaking as she held out the page. "He's putting his own name on it. He's going to tell the Navy that he saved a lieutenant commander's life." Elena read the page once, in silence, and something settled in her that was not rage, exactly. It was the specific, cold clarity of a woman who had spent a decade letting other people's cruelty go unanswered because answering it had never seemed worth the cost. That calculation, she realized, sitting in a recovery room with Jake Reyes's hands still resting in hers, was about to change. If you've ever watched someone try to steal credit for the one thing that finally proved who was really strong all along, drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see this story travel before sunrise. And if you think the truth always finds its way out eventually, subscribe before Chapter 5, because Marcus Wade is about to meet the real United States Navy, and it will not be gentle. At 7:14 that morning, a second helicopter set down in the gravel lot, and this one did not carry a patient. It carried Captain Daniel Reeves, Jake's commanding officer, a man with 20 years of service and a face that had stopped being surprised by anything a decade ago, arriving to check on his lieutenant commander and to personally deliver the after-action findings on the incident that had put Jake in that helicopter in the first place. What Reeves had not expected, walking through the clinic doors, was to find the name Vale on the duty roster and to recognize, instantly and completely, the face of a woman he had once recommended for a commendation that the Navy's bureaucracy had buried alongside her early separation. "Commander Vale," Reeves said, and the entire clinic seemed to hold its breath at the rank attached so plainly to her name. "I heard there was a civilian doctor who ran an emergency thoracotomy on a folding table last night. I did not expect it to be you." Marcus Wade, hearing the word, "Commander," for the second time in 12 hours and finally understanding its full weight, made his final and worst mistake of the night. He stepped forward with his hastily typed incident report in hand, attempting to hand it directly to Captain Reeves, still convinced that controlling the paperwork meant controlling the story. "Captain, I want to make sure the record reflects that I directed the intervention," Wade said, and Reeves, who had spent 28 years learning to read a room in under 4 seconds, looked at the page, looked at Wade, and then looked at Callie, whose expression alone told him everything the paperwork did not. "Nurse," Reeves said, turning to Callie instead of Wade, "walk me through exactly what happened last night, in your own words, and leave nothing out." Callie did not hesitate. She told him about the decompression needle Wade had refused to fetch until Elena demanded it herself. She told him about Wade standing frozen in the doorway. She told him, finally, about finding the rewritten incident report on his desk before dawn. Reeves listened without interrupting, the way men who have run investigations for decades learn to listen, and when Callie finished, he turned back to Wade with an expression that had gone from neutral to something considerably colder. "You are aware," Reeves said, "that submitting a falsified account of a federal medical emergency involving active-duty personnel is not a clinic matter. It is a federal one." Wade's face went the color of old paper. "I was going to correct it," he started, and Reeves cut him off with the flat, unhurried authority of a man who has ended careers with fewer words than this. "You already submitted it to me, Dr. Wade. I read it before I walked through that door." The silence that followed was the kind Elena recognized from a dozen debriefs in her old life, the silence of a man realizing, in real time, that the story he built to protect himself had just become the evidence that destroyed him. What happened over the following hours moved faster than Cutter's Cove had ever seen anything move. Reeves placed a call to the state medical board before he left the parking lot, citing both the falsified federal report and, once Callie mentioned it quietly, 6 months of documented bruises among the clinic's nursing staff from Wade's mandatory self-defense sessions. Sessions that suddenly looked considerably less like training and considerably more like something a federal investigator would want to examine closely. Elena said nothing through most of it, standing at the edge of the room with her arms crossed, watching a man who had spent 11 months calling her the new girl discover, in the space of one storm, exactly how small his authority had always been next to hers. When Reeves finally turned to her and asked, formally, whether she would be willing to provide a statement, Elena looked at Callie first, then at Jake through the recovery room door, and then said the only thing that mattered. "Yes, sir. I'll give you everything you need, and then some. Comment your city or country right now if you felt that shift the second the real Navy walked through that door. I want to know exactly how far this one travels tonight. And if you believe a coward always writes the story he wishes were true instead of the one that actually happened, subscribe before the final chapter, because what Elena decides to do next is the part of this story I promise you at the very beginning." By the time the state medical board's preliminary suspension notice arrived for Marcus Wade 3 days later, Cutter's Cove Family Clinic had already begun to feel like a different building. Nurses who used to flinch when his office door opened now spoke normally in the hallway. Callie, who had spent 6 months quietly nursing a bruise on her wrist she never explained to her own mother, sat across from Elena one slow evening with 2 cups of coffee between them and asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her chest for days. "Will you teach me?" Callie asked. "Not the surgery. I know I'm not ready for that. But how to stand the way you stood that night. How to talk the way you talked, so nobody in this building ever gets away with what he did again." Elena thought of every young corpsman she had trained overseas, every one of them terrified and capable in equal measure, and she thought of a version of herself 12 years younger, sitting in a classroom being told that the only thing that ever mattered in this work was making sure the next person down the line was better prepared than you had been. "Yes," Elena said. "I'll teach you everything that doesn't require a scalpel, and when you're ready, I'll teach you the rest too." Jake stayed at Cutter's Cove for 11 more days while the storm system finally cleared and his transport orders were quietly extended, officially for observation, unofficially because either of them had said out loud yet what both of them already knew. On the 9th night, sitting on the clinic's back porch overlooking a coastline he had not seen properly in 12 years, Jake finally asked the question he had been circling since the moment he opened his eyes and found her face above him. "Why did you pick this town, Elena? Out of every place you could have disappeared to." Elena watched the tide come in, the same tide she had watched alone for 11 months, and gave him the truest answer she had. "Because I read that this clinic had the worst patient outcomes in the county, and I thought if I was going to disappear, I might as well be useful while I did it. I didn't come here to be found. I came here to matter to somebody again, even if nobody knew my name while I did it." Jake reached for her hand the way he had reached for it 12 years earlier, in a different life, on a different coast, and this time she did not pull away. The formal Navy inquiry into Wade's conduct concluded 2 weeks later, and the state board's investigation into the clinic's training sessions opened its own case shortly after, built substantially on statements from nurses who had spent months afraid to give them. Marcus Wade's medical license was suspended pending a full hearing, and the framed photograph in his old office, the one from a Ranger Regiment uniform he had never actually earned the right to wear, was quietly removed by the new interim administrator, who happened to be a retired Navy trauma commander asked, informally at first, to help stabilize the clinic through the transition. Elena did not take the position because she wanted power. She took it because for the first time in 3 years, she understood that disappearing and mattering were not opposites, and that the uniform that had always meant the most to her was never really the one with the rank insignia on the collar. It was the one you put on when you decided, on some ordinary Tuesday, to stop running and start teaching the next person how to stand. On the morning Jake finally returned to active duty, Elena walked him out to the helicopter across the same gravel lot where Marcus Wade had once mocked her for being soft, and where, 6 months from now, Callie would begin her first real training session under Elena's supervision. 3 months, Jake said, holding both her hands before he climbed aboard. I'll be back in 3 months, and I am not asking you to disappear with me this time. I'm asking you to let me stay here, near you, whenever the Navy allows it. Elena smiled, the first real smile Callie had seen from her in 11 months of watching her hide behind a mop and a clipboard. I'm not going anywhere, Elena said. I finally found the one place worth staying found in. The helicopter lifted off into a clean, pale morning sky, and Elena Vale, commander, surgeon, teacher, and finally, after 12 long years, a woman no longer hiding from her own worth, walked back into the clinic that had once tried to make her small, and began the morning rounds as exactly who she had always been. If this story moved you the way I hoped it would, tell me one thing before you go. Comment which chapter hit you hardest tonight, and where in the world you're watching from, because I read every single one of them. And if you believe the quietest person in the room is sometimes the strongest one you'll ever meet, hit subscribe right now, because there is another story just like this one waiting for you next week, and I promise you, it will not disappoint you either.